Welcome, everybody, to this first session of the larger symposium, The Other Slavery. This session is titled Global and National Contexts of Indian Bondage, and will introduce us to some of the larger themes that we'll be dealing with throughout the entire symposium, but we hope will act as a kind of framework and possible guide for us to think about these issues as they interconnect, intersect, and have influence on each other, though much of the conference will focus on slavery of Native people in the Latin American world. We wanted to contextualize that by starting out with this particular panel. So, slavery and involuntary servitude, of course, have existed as a global evil for millennia. Slavery did not first arrive in the Western Hemisphere with European colonizers, but it did change and evolve in that interaction, and was certainly one of the marked impacts on Indigenous demography, political freedom, etc., as well as lifeways and our histories beyond that. So we have three excellent scholars here to help guide us through that territory, help us understand that context of which slavery or unfreedom, as Professor Deloria has referred to it, both morphed and changed in that period. So I want to begin by introducing Professor Philip Deloria. He is the Leverett Saltonstall Professor of History at Harvard University and the author of a number of important books on Indigenous histories, including Plain Indian and Indians in Unexpected Places. He's going to contextualize the larger global and imperial contexts within the first contact and interactions in the Americas, and how those things come to evolve and create the worlds we know of unfreedom throughout the hemisphere. So I'll turn it over to Professor Deloria. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Scott, and it's my great pleasure to be here. I want to thank everyone who's helped to organize the symposium. I'm approaching my part of the session with some trepidation. My colleagues, Tiya and Andrés, have spent careers looking at the histories of enslavement, and I'm just the guy from the planning committee who suggested the need for a broad overview. We can begin that overview with a premise, one that Scott outlined, I think. Human beings have long histories of capture and captivity, coerced labor, brutality, and death exercised on other human beings. The list includes the ancient Middle East, the Western classical world, India and China, Europe and Scandinavia, the Muslim world, and the Americas before contact. Early modern globalization perpetuated and produced new systems of enslavement with terrible results. As Adam Hochschild has pointed out, at the end of the 18th century, 3/4 of the world was in some form of bondage or slavery. I do want to advance a historical argument. Between the 15th and 19th centuries, long-standing and diverse practices of enslavement in the Americas collided with long-standing, diverse, and transforming practices of enslavement in Europe, Africa, and elsewhere to produce new hybrid forms. This collision of unfreedoms and coerced labor likely made the Americas and the Caribbean the most thoroughly and complexly enslaved landscape in American history or in human history. In this world, Indigenous people were enslaved, captured and traded slaves, and enslaved others. The story of slavery in the Americas cannot be told without sustained attention to Native peoples. Well, with only a few minutes to cover centuries and continents, I plan to organize this argument through three typological lists. First, enslavement in Indigenous North America. Second, enslavement in a global and primarily European context. And third, the new forms of unfreedom that developed in relation to European imperialism and colonialism. The categories, as you can imagine, are gestural at best. So let's begin. How might we catalog some of these long-standing and diverse practices of enslavement in North America? Let's start with warfare slavery, an original and global phenomenon. Victors capture their enemies and they make them into slaves. Some have argued that large state-based societies are more likely to enslave men for their labor. But the smaller societies are more likely to kill their male captives. It's too hard to control them, it's impossible to integrate them. And so those societies then enslave women and children. Both those modes were present in the Americas. Status slavery. On the Pacific Northwest coast and elsewhere, ownership of other people and their labor functioned as a marker of social status, a form of wealth rich with social meaning. This slavery could be natal, that is, passed down across generations, and slaves made up 20 to 40% of a typical village's population in some places. Enslaved people were routinely killed at the funerals of their owners, and that points to sacrifice slavery. In the Great Lakes and elsewhere, captive fighters were often subject to torture, which served as a social performance of revenge and thus a form of social healing. In other places, as in the case of Mesoamerica, the captured slave was used in religious sacrifice. Such captives never served as working slaves, but this sacrifice slavery delivered forms of value just the same. Many places in native North America had systems of what we can call commercial slavery. That is, warfare did not produce slaves as a byproduct. Rather, raiding and captivity were directly aimed at gathering slaves for trade. California offers two paradigmatic forms of indigenous unfreedom: debt slavery and voluntary slavery. As part of a compensatory justice that required payment, a person who could not pay might be enslaved for some period of time. During that period, the person was truly owned, could be passed along as chattel in an economic transaction. Similarly, in a time of scarcity, a person could voluntarily offer themselves as a slave to a richer person in order to guarantee food and survival. Many tribes did not view slavery as a permanent condition, and an enslaved person might move through social categories with limited fluidity. Prominent among such social shifts was the slave who became integrated as kinship slavery, one of the things we've talked most about in the recent literature on slavery. Fictive kin, functional kin, or even replacement kin. Because when a tribal nation lost population, demographic regrowth required new forms of social integration. Unsurprisingly, such forms of slavery often targeted children, more easily integrated, and women for their reproductive capacity. And one might call these practices a form of demographic slavery, replacement slavery. And then there are other slaveries. This exercise in making descriptive categories inevitably blunts and simplifies other equally complex forms of unfreedom and coercion, and we should recognize the existence of those as well. Now, Europeans had an equally well-established range of unfreedom and coercive labor practices, as did other people that were part of this global system. We can start, again, with warfare slavery. In the Muslim world and in Europe, this rested upon the identity of the defeated. Were they Muslim or were they Christian? And it rested on the nature of the war. The doctrine of just war allowed the taking of defeated people as slaves. And so leaders went out of their way, oftentimes in farcical manner, to ensure that their wars were just. Europe also featured commercial slave raiding and impressment. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, for example, the Barbary pirates and slave traders of the North African coast captured well over 1 million slaves from England, France, Ireland, Italy, and elsewhere. And then we can maybe point to something called insider slavery, in which slaves served as advisors and agents for leaders and sometimes even inherited their leadership. In the Muslim world, concubine mothers produced heirs who posed no threat to other leaders and so replaced earlier practices of elite intermarriage. Eunuchs, also posing no threat to heirship, were simultaneously enslaved but could also be trusted administrators. The meeting of war and commerce helped produce what one might name as collective slavery. The Spanish system of repartimiento, for example, assigned the labor of a subject population to a single overlord, an encomendero responsible for arranging work gangs for specific labor. The owner of the repartimiento right held a monopoly on the group's labor, and it was heritable and transferable, a right of property, in other words. The system was honed in the centuries-long Reconquista of Spain, but it proved almost perfectly adapted to the Spanish settlements in the Americas. Repartimiento, one might say, bore a passing similarity to the old feudal system of serfdom, in which individuals were bound to land. serfs could be bought and sold, not as individuals, but with land and property. Since such transactions took place at the level of the estate, serfs were in effect bound together with other serfs in a collective group of unfree workers. Europeans, and particularly on the Iberian Peninsula, also embarked on forms of commercial slavery. Witness the slave markets in Lisbon and in Seville, where Columbus planned to sell his first loads of Indian people. By the 1500s, as many as 70 slave merchants worked the streets of Lisbon, and as much as 10% of the population was African and enslaved, with auctions and markets held in the town square and slaves paraded as if livestock. The English, in particular, developed a system of convict labor in which the unfreedom of the prisoner was linked with the possibility of productive labor, either coerced or compensated so minimally as to be symbolic only. And the English had their own history of colonial enslavement, including the late 17th century transportation of Irish rebels to the Caribbean. And finally, while developing slightly later in time, no survey of European forms of unfreedom would be complete without a mention of indentured servitude. The commodity bought and sold was not, strictly speaking, the person or the body, but the labor itself. But that labor was not contracted in the short term, as in a wage or salary, but was measured over years. Its long duration meant that masters had significant control over apprentices and indentured servants, and thus exercised modes of coercion. Indenture was not at all the same thing as chattel slavery. Let's be clear about that. It was, however, a form of unfreedom that would prove particularly well suited to the colonial situation. It could be combined with convict labor, with debt peonage. Each would-be European empire realized that they could not execute a successful colonial project without first taking someone else's land, and second, to make the wealth in land productive of other wealth, taking other people's labor. The center of that taking was Africa, the continent of old societies with its own range of unfreedoms, whose people were pulled into a global slavery rendered unstable by the capitalist development of commodity markets and humans, colonial land seizures, and new goods, sugar, tobacco, and cotton. Those goods drove near bottomless demand and thus created a global slave system freed of limit, such that Africa saw 12.5 million of its people endure a forced migration to death and unfreedom in the Americas, to say nothing of those enslaved elsewhere, or the monumental death and suffering that cannot be captured by the numbers. That market system, modern, global, and oceanic, produced not just new slaveries, as we know, but a new conception of race, centered on the category of blackness, and along with it, a dialectical opposite of whiteness. But the development of these new slaveries in the Atlantic world was more than just brutal African diaspora. It was also a set of other slaveries, kaleidoscopic in nature, as our colleague Andrés Reséndez has suggested, and deeply centered around indigenous people. What kinds of unfreedoms might appear on a new list, one that's both typological and hybrid, that combines these other two lists? So, European slave raiding. Columbus's second voyage, for instance, aimed to take indigenous people and insert them as just another population into existing European slave markets. And this happened, of course, across the globe. Translational slavery, in which individuals were seized by coasting ships on the Atlantic and taught European languages with the intent that they serve as enslaved translators. Interconnected slave raid and trade systems. Indigenous slaving networks, both existing and newly developed, took new shape as they were articulated with European networks. In New France, for instance, interconnected systems moved Indian slaves, captured by other native peoples, from the heart of the continent to the Atlantic and into the Caribbean. And proxy wars. In the Southeast, for example, the Carolina colony armed a series of tribes as slave raiders, sent out to destroy other tribes, often tribes who had once been their slave raiding allies. And colonial wars served as both occasions for land acquisition and instances of warfare slavery. New England wars, including the Pequot War and King Philip's War, devastated populations, acquired native lands, and created pools of enslaved Indians taken into New England homes and also traded as commodities. New England, with its colonial wars, also offers an excellent example of a new kind of replacement slavery, in which Indians were traded for Africans from the Caribbean, and thus removed far from home, and thus the possibility of escape, and then eventually dissolved into the new racial order that made enslavement and blackness mutually constitutive. Hostage slavery. Russians in Alaska seized the families of Aleut hunters, forcing them to participate in massive seal hunts in order to ransom their own people. The Russians proved as merciless as other Europeans, raising and killing entire villages and routinely sending hunters in kayaks into suicidal ocean conditions. Collective slavery. The transplanted and transformed Spanish institutions of encomienda and repartimiento, which I will leave to Andrés to talk a little bit about. And then what we might call five-tribe slavery, perhaps the most visible hybrid adaptation historically was that found among the so-called five tribes of the Southeast, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muskogee, and Seminole, who adopted models of American chattel enslavement of African and African-descended peoples, not only the form of the plantation, the classic form, but smallholder forms and other forms as well. In the Southwest, complex hybrid forms of slave raiding and trading joined indigenous and colonial systems together to produce new detribalized populations. The result was a collection of Indians known as Janiceros, mixing, mingling, and laboring in the Spanish settlement. This will be one of the topics that we will talk about later in the symposium. And then indenture and convict unfreedom. Indian people forced into colonial legal systems were sentenced to indentures as criminal punishment, often renewed repeatedly in order to keep them working and under control. Oftentimes, Indian people were put into regimes of debt, thrown into prison, and then extracted from prison in order to actually work and labor in ways not under their own control. And to this, one might add the captive labor of children at the boarding schools of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Death slavery. There are no doubt other kinds and categories of unfreedom, as well as exceptions and complications. But I can't conclude this survey without noting what might be the most important form of emergent slavery in the Americas, what we might call death slavery, which takes unfreedom and coerced labor as a genocidal method of killing people, a settler colonial form of slavery that aimed to eliminate starvation plus killing work plus the denial of reproduction for the population. Bartolomé de las Casas framed the elements quite explicitly. He said, "Nor to either the men or the women did they give any food except herbs, and legumes, things of little substance. The milk in the breasts of the women with infants dried up, and thus in a short while the infants perished. And since men and women were separated, there could be no marital relations. And the men died in the mines, and the women died on the ranches from the same causes, exhaustion and hunger, and thus was depopulated that island which had been densely populated." And, as Andrés Reséndez and Benjamin Madley, among others, have pointed out, this form of genocidal slavery was perhaps both the first and last expression of historical enslavements in the Americas. It began in the Spanish Caribbean, but was renewed in the mid-19th century in California, even extending beyond the passage of the 13th Amendment. The United States, then, was not simply the inheritor and supporter of the African slavery that had kick-started Atlantic mercantile capitalism and new formations of race and blackness. Between 1492 and 1900, between 200,000 and 400,000 Indian people endured slavery in North America, numbers that stand in relation to the 350,000 to 400,000 Africans brought to North America before the end of the slave trade in 1808. By the beginning of the Civil War, that number had, of course, ballooned to 4 million plus people. The United States also inherited a long and diverse continental history of slavery in North America, one that augmented the Atlantic slave trade to create new interconnected circuits and new hybrid forms. A well-traveled journey of unfreedom from the plains and Great Lakes down the St. Lawrence, a siphon stretching across the Southeast and emptying through Charleston, a taut line from New England to Bermuda, a blanket covering the Southwest, folded to pour into Santa Fe, a maritime loop connecting Hawaii and the Pacific with the Northwest, a cord tying Russia to the Aleutians and then dangling down the coast, a series of Indian-owned plantations binding the Southeast to Indian territory with continuing consequence today. As slave owners, slave raiders, and enslaved people, Native Americans have been at the very heart of a complex global trade and the development of new permeating systems of unfreedom and coerced labor that have made North America among the most enslaved places in the history of the planet. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Deloria, for that really excellent and succinct orientation for us, putting this global context in play, because it is a much more complex issue than I think a lot of us initially think of. You know, we're used to thinking of the term slavery, at least in the United States, in terms of black and white. And this whole symposium is in, you know, in response to the genuine complexities around the issue of unfreedom raised by works like Professor Reséndez's, but also in works of our next speaker, Professor Tiya Miles, who is a professor of history and the Radcliffe alumni professor at Harvard University, who is, as many of you will know, an author of 6 books and an impressive range of award-winning books, and ones that really give a more human face to some of these larger issues that we've been discussing. If we were thinking of the kind of global international landscape of servitude and bondage, as Professor Deloria presented to us, Professor Miles will help us understand the more human face of slavery in the Americas, using the archive to uncover the stories of individuals, of families, and of communities, all impacted by slavery throughout the 18th and 19th century. And so with that, I would like to turn it over to Professor Miles and welcome her. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Scott. And thank you all for being here. I want to express my appreciation to the organizers of this panel and also to my colleague, Phil, who just gave a wonderfully detailed explanatory breakdown of various forms of enslavement across the globe. As Scott mentioned, what I would like to do with my 15 minutes on our panel today is to offer a more intimate view of enslavement and resistance to captivity, or as close as we can come to intimacy, given the paucity of records about individual and family experiences. And in telling these stories, I would like to reveal the overlaps and the intersections between African and Native slavery in what is now the United States. I'm going to focus on places where we tend to associate slavery less, that is, places in the North. I'm going to talk about Detroit in the Midwest and also Nantucket Island up in New England. And as I tell these stories, I hope that we can keep our eyes and ears on the ways in which captivity is changing over time and the ways in which it is hardening, especially for Africans and people of African descent. So first, I will offer a bird's eye view, an overview of these 2 places of emphasis. And then I will move into our slides and talk about specific families and individuals. Some framing, some context. As we now know, slavery permeated all parts of the American nation and its predecessor colonies. The practice of buying, selling, owning, renting, and mortgaging human beings, as well as the legal structures and institutional norms fashioned to fix and rationalize that activity, profoundly influenced politics, economics, local customs, and cultural formations. For over 300 years, the US and the colony that preceded it functioned as a carceral landscape, in the words of the historian Walter Johnson. This was a place where fortunes were built and a white national identity was forged through kidnap, containment, and forcible relocations of millions of unfree people of color across an expanding terrain taken from indigenous nations. Despite what the historian Joanne Pope Mellish has called the persistence of a, quote, triumphant narrative of a historically free white New England, end quote, the northeastern region of this country thrived in a system of slavery. Desirous of much needed but difficult to come by labor, to build their towns, work their wharves, tend their farms, and supply and keep their households, Puritans in Massachusetts Bay Colony, Dutch settlers in New Netherland, and even Quakers in Pennsylvania availed themselves of racialized slave labor, along with the labor of indentured servants from diverse backgrounds. Native Americans taken as captives in colonial wars first fell victim to the slave trade, and soon, as the historian Margaret Newell argues, slave acquisition became a motivating factor in colonists' decisions to go to war with neighboring Native groups. After the Pequot War of 1637, English combatants took 48 Native captives and installed them in Massachusetts and Connecticut towns. Property in Indian slaves allowed New Englanders to enter the lucrative international trade with Caribbean islands that would become essential to their character as a shipping society. As New Englanders imported sugar to produce rum and exported raw materials like wood, they also transported native slaves to trading partners in the West Indies. There existed a, quote, mirror relationship between Native and Black exploitation, as noted by the historian Wendy Warren. In 1638, just 1 year after the Pequot War, a ship based in Salem delivered the first documented Africans to arrive in Massachusetts. The Massachusetts Bay Colony legalized slavery in 1641. And that legalization assumed the presence of Africans as well as American Indians among the enslaved population. The witch trials that would occur in Salem in 1692 and 93 included among the first accused an enslaved indigenous woman named Tiya from the Caribbean. Slavery in Massachusetts ended by court decision in 1783. The Midwest never sponsored a slavery regime on the scale of the northeastern coastal cities or southeastern rice and cotton plantations. But colonial forts and early towns in this interior region did extract slave labor from a few thousand Native Americans and people of African descent from the early 1700s through the mid 1800s. The Great Lakes was the home and hunting ground of numerous indigenous bands, groups, and nations: Ojibways, Potawatomis, Odawas, Hurons, Sacs and Fox peoples, and Illinois peoples, among others. Here, as in most areas across the continent, Native Americans engaged in a form of slavery characterized by the seizure and subjugation of war captives following intertribal conflicts. Indigenous bondage was violent and based in group difference. However, it was not a race-based or hereditary system like the chattel slavery Europeans would develop. As a critical French and then British military post in the region, the town of Detroit, founded in 1701, became a hub for Midwestern slavery. Hundreds of people, indigenous women, men, and children, were compelled to labor there in conditions similar to the household-based urban slavery and limited agricultural slavery characteristic of New York. Black men were difficult for slaveholders to acquire due to Detroit's distance from the east. Alongside Native men, African American men were put to work in the fur trade, on the crews of Great Lakes ships, in the caravans carrying goods hundreds of miles over land and waterways, and on the farms of wealthy traders. When the U.S. acquired the Great Lakes Territory from the British following the American Revolutionary War, slavery in Detroit and Michigan continued. Although the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 prohibited slavery in writing, the federal law included loopholes, lacked enforcement, and included a provision for the return of fugitives from other parts of the country. French and British settlers already present in the region were permitted to continue owning people. Americans moving into the region can marry into these old families, rent individuals from them, and disguise slave purchases as contracts for indentured servitude. American visitors and tourists could travel freely with their human property. While the numbers of enslaved people held in Michigan dropped in the early 1800s, slavery continued until the state constitution banned the practice in 1837. And now I'll move into some images and stories of these two places, beginning with Detroit. Here we see a riverscape of the town of Detroit, which shows the importance of its maritime activity. And this is a map of the Detroit River region at the time when the town of Detroit actually spanned the river. It existed on both sides of the river. The most interesting aspect of this map, I think, is the way in which it indicates the land holdings of early French and British settlers. All of those long and narrow strips that we see above the river are farms. The large central piece of land that we see on the map is the place of the town itself, the location that we saw in the previous slide. Most of these prime areas, most of these ribbon farms, as they are called, belonged to slaveholders. And so what we identify as farms in Detroit in this late 18th century period were places where enslaved people were compelled to labor for their owners. And here we have a sense of numbers, the numbers of people who were held as property, as unfree laborers in Detroit. These numbers come from censuses, which often did not indicate whether the people who were enslaved were African, African descended, or Indigenous. But we do have a sense of that kind of granular detail from church records, from the parish records of St. Anne's Catholic Church in Detroit. What we can see from these numbers, just as a snapshot, is that enslaved people increased in number over time in Detroit. This is not often the kind of trajectory that we expect. Certainly, it's not one that we would hope for. But during the American Revolutionary War period, the numbers of people who were unfree in Detroit went up. As Americans were fighting for their freedom, enslaved people were increasing in this area. And over the long span of time that Detroiters held enslaved people, Indigenous women were the largest number of those who were enslaved. This image of a document gives us another way of entering into the story of slavery in Detroit. This is a partial page of an inventory of the property of the late William McComb, who was the largest slaveholder in Detroit and who owned approximately 26 people. Here we see a list of several of their names next to their values. By the time William McComb was acquiring and owning enslaved people, his laborers were mostly African American and of African descent. Here we have another way of entering in. Now, this is a document that comes from the papers of John Askin. John Askin was a British trader in the Detroit area who was among William McComb's social set and among his business colleagues. This inventory shows us that John Askin had enslaved people who were of African descent and who were also Native. who were also indigenous. And we can see here in this document that um, Black enslaved people are being described as Negro, and Native enslaved people are being described as Panu, Panis, which is a term used to refer to Indigenous enslaved in this area at the time. We can see here that John Askin had men and women, and he also had children. We can see that boys were among his holdings, and that men, both Black and Indigenous men, were considered by Askin to be among his most valuable human property. John Askin, as a slaveholder in Detroit, also opens up a window into a very dark aspect of this history. And that is the aspect of the enslavement of Indigenous women who were held as sex slaves, who were held as concubines, for lack of a better word that would really capture the violence and the horror and pain of that experience. John Askin owned a Native American woman whose indigenous nation is not listed in the records. Her name was Mane or Monet, and we know about her because he freed her in the 1760s after having had 3 children with her. Askin married again. He married a French woman, and he and his second wife raised the children of Manet or Monet, who at that point drops out of the documentary record. We can only imagine what she must have felt being separated from her children. Here we see a lithograph that is featuring John Askin's home in Detroit. It is called the Brush Place because John Askin's son-in-law and his daughter, Adelaide Askin, ended up purchasing the home from John Askin at a very reasonable price. And Elijah Brush, although he was American, although he was a New Englander, although he went to Dartmouth College, participated in the slaving economy in Detroit. And he did so in very diverse, unexpected ways. Elijah Brush was an attorney in the town. He sometimes defended enslaved people seeking their freedom, and he sometimes defended slaveholders and enslavers who were seeking to continue to hold captive African descended people. This location is the setting of a part of one of the most dramatic stories we have of enslavement in Detroit. And that is the story of the Denison family. The African American Denison family was a family started by Peter Denison and Hannah Denison. They were owned by a white British couple named William and Catherine Tucker. Upon William's death, the children of Peter and Hannah Denison were to be divided among the Williamses' children. Among the Tuckers' children. And at that time, Catherine Tucker entered into a contract of indenture with Elijah Brush. That contract of indenture sent Peter and Hannah Denison to this residence, to the Brush Place, where they were to labor for a year as unfreed people. At the end of their indenture, a very interesting thing happened, and that is they actually took Catherine Tucker to court and sued for their children's freedom. The outcome of the case was mixed. In 1807, Chief Justice Augustus Woodward of Michigan Territory issued a decision which said that enslaved people born before a certain time would still be enslaved. Enslaved people born after a certain time would be enslaved for a period of years, and enslaved people born in the future would be free. So this was a win for some enslaved people, but not all. The woman pictured here is Elizabeth Denison, daughter of Peter and Hannah Denison, one of the children who would not have been freed by this ruling. She and her family escaped across the border to Canada to try to obtain their freedom. Elizabeth Denison, later, upon her death, left enough funds to found a church in which she insisted impoverished people must be welcomed and cared for. And so the second case or story that I'd like to share takes place on Nantucket Island. It's a very small island off the coast of Massachusetts, um, sort of to the south and west. The image next to the map of Nantucket, which dates to 1659, is of the single remaining windmill on the island. And this windmill plays a role in the story of enslaved people on Nantucket. So Nantucket followed in the tracks of most of Massachusetts in terms of its willingness to adopt African and Native American enslavement. Native people, who are mostly Wampanoag people on the island, were being pushed onto smaller and smaller parcels of land. They were being decimated by disease, ushered in by English presence, and they were becoming impoverished to the English. In response to this, the English forced, compelled a system of debt peonage in which Native people would be forced to work, especially on whaling ships, to try to balance out or pay off their debt. The children of Native people were also caught up in the system of debt slavery because of the death of their parents. In addition, Indigenous people on Nantucket were owned, held, traded, sold, passed down in wills as enslaved people, just like African Americans and African descended people on the island. And yes, there were African people who were enslaved on Nantucket, beginning in the early 1700s. They were forced to work again on whaling ships and also in domestic spaces, in homes and in shops on the island. Many African people and African descended people were skilled laborers, especially in the weaving trade, as one of Nantucket's major industries was raising sheep. One of the families that we know about on Nantucket is the family called the Bostons. An African man named Boston was married to an African woman named Maria. They had several children, and they were all owned by a ship captain named William Swain. William Swain issued a decision that he would gradually emancipate the Boston family and their children in the 1760s. At this point, Boston and Maria moved to the area by the windmill that I showed a moment ago. This was an area that was inland on the island. It was not sought after by English, by Europeans. It was beyond the English sheep fence. So it was out in the boondocks. This is where they started a new community after they were freed. Seneca Boston was a son of theirs. And this whaling ship ledger in the early 1800s shows Seneca Boston receiving payment for having worked on the ship. Seneca Boston married a Wampanoag woman named Thankful Micah. And Thankful Micah had been a survivor of a terrible epidemic which took place on the island in 1763 and 1764 that killed many of the remaining Indigenous peoples in the town of Mayacomet. People who managed to survive that epidemic from the town of Mayacomet tended to move toward this location where the Boston family had settled, which became known as New Guinea and which enlarged as a mostly Black and also Wampanoag town. Seneca and Thankful built a house in the town, and they had several children. And I think it's quite beautiful that the first son was named Freeborn Boston. It shows us the intense meaning of freedom for this family. And here we see an image of one of their younger sons, Absalom Austin. He became famous because he himself was uh, a whale ship captain. He is known as the first African American man, African descended man to captain a ship out of Nantucket's waters, which he did in the early 1820s. He was also a businessman and a community leader. He co founded the African Baptist Church in this community, and he also received a license to open a public inn. By the 1820s and the 1830s, enslaved people from the US South were making their way to Nantucket because New Guinea was a community that would welcome them. By that time, New Guinea was a heavily mixed race, mixed culture community. It was both African and Wampanoag, because Wampanoags in Martha's Vineyard and Cape Cod were also moving in and marrying into African descended families. Regarding Absalom Boston's ship, the industry, it's often described as a ship on which an all-Black crew manned the vessel. I suspect that that so-called all-Black crew was a Black and Native crew, mirroring the makeup of their town. So here we have a photograph from the 1970s of the African Baptist Church that Absalom Boston co-founded. This is a photograph of that church today, which is called the African Meeting House. The church still stands, as does the home that Seneca and Thankful built. And they are both testaments to the experiences of enslaved people, African descent, enslaved people of Indigenous heritage and nationality, and they bear witness to the resilience, to the creativity, and to the willingness to keep carrying on of those survivors. Thank you.
Well, I just want to thank you, Professor Miles, for those wonderfully rich examples of lives lived by enslaved people seeking their freedom. And those are the type of really rich stories that you help bring to life for your readers and students. And I think that one of the aspects I so value about it is the way that it disrupts these old binaries of Black and white, North and South, and really makes us understand the greater reaches of these issues and the continuing legacy of them. That I certainly will look forward to visiting that meeting house in Nantucket the next time I'm in New England. That will be a spot of reverence for me. So thank you for that. And I want now to switch to our final speaker in this symposium or this presentation on slavery, Indian slavery in its global and national context. And that is Professor Andrés Reséndez, who is a professor of history at University of California, Davis, and the author of the groundbreaking work, The Other Slavery, The Uncovered Story of Indian Enslavement in the Americas. This book in 2016 really was a revelation to a lot of us. It gave us a greater sense of just the scope of this world of Indigenous or Indian slavery in the Americas. And I think that one of the reasons I was very glad that we could contextualize the work of Professor Reséndez and others who will speak later on in the symposium is that I was anxious not to kind of recapitulate the old Black legend of Spanish cruelty that somehow gave a pass to the Protestant powers of Northern Europe, especially the English, and a kind of Anglophile historiography that we inherit from the early 19th century American historians. So that said, one has to realize by the sheer scope of the Spanish imperial project in the Americas that it is a very heavy and large footprint, though by no means a singular one. And this is what I think your work has really helped us better understand, but also understand and critique the kind of latent biological determinism that was in explanations of, the die-off of native populations, kind of somehow eschewed the violence of genocide via slavery and indenture and forced labor, and made it a kind of biological inevitability that seemed to be no one's fault in particular. And I think your work has offered a truly invaluable corrective to that old discussion. So with that said, I'd like to turn it over to you, Professor, and hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, first of all, Scott, for this very gracious introduction and for your very insightful points. And thank you also to Phil and Tiya for these wonderful presentations. It is an honor to share the podium with all three of you. What I thought I would do is to try to offer an intermediate scale between Phil's wonderfully global introduction and Tiya's equally wonderful, very grounded and concrete and tangible presentation, which is to try to provide a sense of the scope and the timing of these phenomenon of Indian slavery in the Americas. And I don't really want to belabor points already made. I just, to start with, emphasize the point that Phil made already, that in the 14th, 15th centuries, we were living in a world of slavery all around the world, and the Americas was no exception to that. And I just thought about showing you a couple of really beautiful and very stark evidence of this reality in the New World. So at the top, I'm showing you a classic Maya site of what is obviously a captive. You can see him there. And also to note that epigraphists have already deciphered the glyphs for captivity, for something akin to captivity. And that is at the top in hundreds of years before the arrival of Europeans. And at the bottom, I'm showing you the beautiful Codex Mendoza, which was created immediately after contact in the 1540s and 1550s. But the pictorial convention was something that was used even before the arrival of Europeans, and you can see these individuals holding other people by the hair, which was the pictorial convention for captivity. It was that common of an institution, and you can also see the Spanish gloss if you go very close to it, saying cautivo or captive. So it existed, these types of institutions existed in the New World for thousands of years before the arrival of Europeans, but 1492 changed the circumstances in two very fundamental ways. Philip already alluded to a very interesting argument about the colliding of different types of enslavement. But one of the overarching results of this collision was the greater commodification of these practices. These practices were originally embedded in very specific cultural contexts, and they became more commercial, more commodified after the arrival of Europeans. And second of all, they became larger in terms of the scope, the geographic scope that they took place in. So, and I will give you some examples of these incredible scope that would have been unthinkable prior to the arrival of Europeans. To go back to Scott's point, all Europeans participated in these business of enslavement of natives. The English, the French, the Portuguese, the Dutch, all of them did it. But Spain became the slaving power for two very obvious reasons. One was that Spain came to control the larger part of the hemisphere, of the Western Hemisphere, and also the most densely populated part of the hemisphere. So therefore, the opportunities for enslavement were much greater to the Spanish Empire than to the other empires, number one. And number two, Spain lacked direct ports on the western coast of Africa, and it always needed to negotiate with the other European powers in order to secure African slaves. So it was much easier for the Spanish Empire, in order to do all the things that it needed to do and extract in the New World, to simply resort to coerced labor by indigenous peoples. Ironically, and this again speaks very directly to Scott's very point, Spain started out by actually outlawing the enslavement of Native Americans. Slavery was an old institution in Europe, but it was still the case that before sales of slaves could be conducted in Europe, a judge, at least in the Iberian Peninsula, had to determine the legality of those sales, and whether the person who was actually being sold could be enslavable. And so this question of the enslavability of Native Americans was one that arose very early on, even in Columbus's times. And the Spanish Crown permitted the practice in some special circumstances. And finally, in 1542, it finally decided to close all the loops with the issuing of the so-called new laws. By then, however, devastation had occurred in many parts of the New World, and most especially in the Caribbean. So we know a little bit about what went on, because perhaps the most prolific early Spanish chronicler, Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo, or simply Oviedo, who was an incredibly gregarious man who got to know all of the major players of the era, and he was himself a miner, left us very vivid descriptions of what gold mining in early colonial Latin America was like. And this is his own drawing, which I find very persuasive for its simplicity and the brutality of the activity. So basically, you see three figures. On the right-hand side, you see an individual digging with a very crude instrument, and that was usually done close to a river. So basically, the idea was to gather as much ground or sand from close to a river. That was transported on a huge pan made out of wood called batea by a second crew, and that was in turn given to a third crew that was often composed of women, who were the ones washing away the sand and leaving the gold at the very bottom. So these activities that occurred in the island of Hispaniola, the island now shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic, was the main economic activity that structured life in the Caribbean early on, and it claimed the lives of countless of Native Americans who were forced to participate in these type of activities for 12, 13, 14, 17 hours a day, leaving no time whatsoever for reproduction or for planting of crops or any other activities. So these led to this early collapse, and as a result of that, there was a backlash within the Spanish Empire. Some of these figures, like Bartolomé de las Casas, are well known to students of early history. But the result of that was the issuing of a new legal compact known as the New Laws of 1548, which basically outlawed Indian slavery under all circumstances. And it also severely curtailed many other activities having to do with the coercion of natives in the New World. Of course, this new laws did not end the enslavement of Native Americans. It did so in the Old World, so thousands of Native Americans were actually shipped across the Atlantic to Europe, in particular to Spain. And that traffic pretty much ceased in the aftermath of the new laws. But what is really incredible to realize is that the tremendous opposition that existed to the new laws in the Americas. Basically, the Spanish officer in charge of enforcing the new laws in Peru was murdered. He was decapitated, and his head was shown. And in the case of Mexico, the Spanish official sent there to enforce the new laws was not murdered, but he clearly feared for his life, and he decided prudently to suspend some of the provisions of the new law pending further instructions, which probably saved his life. So the point was the incredible staying power of these coercive labor practices that endured in spite of the Crown's very clear set of laws prohibiting those activities. Instead, what happened was a metastasis, so to speak. So these, because Europeans could not openly talk about slavery, they devised euphemisms and resorted to legal roundabouts in order to continue benefiting from the coerced labor of natives, devising some of the institutions that already Phil alluded to, like encomiendas, repartimientos, Indians in deposit, and genízaros, and so on. There are so many, both at the imperial level, but also at the regional and more local levels. So this is the situation that we have in the 16th century, and we know that Indian slavery continued to proliferate because well over a century after the issuing of these new laws of 1542, we have a remarkable campaign launched by the Spanish crown, launched by Philip IV and his wife Mariana, Queen Mariana, who received reports from various parts of the Spanish Indies, alarming reports to them because they were very religious, very pious, and this was, of course, contrary to Spanish law, about the enslavement, the widespread enslavement of Native Americans in these regions. And so we have scores of letters and documentation from various parts of the New World reaching the Madrid, detailing some of these activities. And that's how we know about some of the hotspots or about some of the regions where these activities were especially prevalent. So if you look at the map, the first and probably the most daunting and morally fraught area was in Chile, in what is now southern Chile, south of the Rio Bio. Where slavery became legal between 1608 and 1674. So I said that the Spanish crown outlawed, but this was not a matter of human rights. It was something that could be taken away depending on the case. And because of a particularly egregious activity on the part of the natives of southern Chile, the Spanish crown decided to remove this protection on native peoples of that region. And as a result of this legalization of Indian slavery, it really proliferated and created a remarkable traffic. Natives from southern Chile were walked all the way to Valparaíso, which is a major port in Chile. And then from there, they were shipped as far north as Callao in what is now the coast of Peru. So again, a network of enslavement that would have been unthinkable before the arrival of Europeans. A second space was that of across in the Andes, in a major slaving zone that extended through the provinces of Paraguay and Tucumán and adjacent areas. A third area of enslavement were the llanos of Colombia and Venezuela. So these are the grasslands crisscrossed by the tributaries of the Orinoco River. And here, what is really interesting is that the Spanish traffickers competed with English, French, and above all, Dutch networks of enslavement. And the main providers of slaves in this area were the Carib Indians, a group of natives whom the Spanish had sought to exterminate, but ended up adapting to these terrible circumstances and found a way to survive and thrive on these new traffic. A fourth major slaving ground existed in northern Mexico. This was large and internally fragmented. And the last major area of enslavement, as revealed by this documentation of the late 17th century, was in the Philippines, where Europeans had stumbled on a dazzling world of slaves. So this is how situations stood in the 17th century and continued through the end of the colonial period, and survived well into the 19th century. And so I just want to conclude my presentation by offering the case of Mexico, which is in some ways a very typical example of these transformation of Indian slavery into newer forms of coercion that already Phil was alluding to. So immediately after independence from Spain in 1821, Mexico extended citizenship rights to all natives living within the country. Yet, at the same time that the federal government is turning indigenous peoples into full-fledged Mexican citizens, state legislatures hastened to regulate servitude and vagrancy. And so even though outright Indian slavery was no longer possible, debt peonage, that is the involuntary holding of persons until the liquidation of a debt, actually proliferated in many states. So in the state of Yucatan, for example, in southern Mexico, the movement of people was restricted through a certificate system. So you had to show a certificate that clear you from any obligations from your previous employer before you could move around. Lashes, lockdowns, and shackles were commonly used both in southern Mexico and also in northern Mexico, including places that are now the American Southwest, like California and New Mexico. The best example of this, the most insightful example, at least to me, is offered by an American journalist by the name of John Kenneth Turner, who posed as a millionaire investor and traveled to Yucatan in 1908. And he was thus welcomed by the planters, and he asked them questions about where they got their workers, how the working system was, etc. And he got amazing answers to that. For example, one was like, slavery is against the law. We do not call it slavery. One of his hosts said, but the planters were quite forthcoming about how debts served as a tool of coercion. We do not consider that we own our laborers. We consider that they are in debt to us, the president of the Agricultural Chamber of Yucatan told Turner. And we do not consider that we buy and sell them, but we consider that we transfer the debt and the man goes with the debt. So slavery in Mexico in the 20th century, yes, I found it, wrote Turner in his extraordinary expose published on the eve of the Mexican Revolution in 1910. According to the journalist, the slave population of Yucatan consisted of some 8,000 Native Americans from Sonora in northern Mexico, the Yaquis, forcibly transported in railroads and ships all the way to Yucatan. It also included some 3,000 Koreans who were serving 4 or 5-year labor contracts, and between 100,000 and 125,000 Mayas who were also laboring in these plantations. Altogether, and just to finish, anywhere between 2.5 and 5 million Native Americans were enslaved throughout the hemisphere in the centuries between the arrival of Columbus and the beginning of the 20th century, according to my very preliminary and subject to challenge estimates, but we need to begin somewhere. A story of Indian slavery with uncertain beginnings, banned early on in the colonial period, but that nonetheless persisted through the 19th century and with no clear endpoint, is disappointing in these is disappointing. In this story, there is no Civil War or Abraham Lincoln or Emancipation Proclamation. In this symposium, we call it the other slavery, in obvious opposition to the type of African slavery that is most familiar to most of us since grade school. However, in some ways, African slavery is the somewhat outlier, a type of bondage sanctioned by empires around the world for centuries that required moving millions of people from one continent to another. Far more typical is what we are discussing and persist until today, a type of bondage that is formally prohibited, but nonetheless occurs in the real world with euphemisms and as a result of prison sentences or indebtedness, or unfolds behind closed doors in sweatshops, brick factories, aboard fishing boats, and other such sites. In this sense, what Native Americans experienced over the course of more than 400 years is not merely a colonial legacy, but an important forerunner of what some scholars have called modern-day forms of slavery, and in fact have a very long history. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Reséndez. That's really helpful to give us not only that deep but broad history of Spanish, Indigenous indenture and slavery, but also I especially liked at the end of your comments how you very much and poignantly brought it into the present, because this is not a sin of the past that we're revisiting as though everything was solved. And in fact, there are different forms of modern day slavery, as we know, and human trafficking that continue to be endemic around the world, especially with people in situations of refugeeism or chronic poverty, racism, continuing racism, etc. So I really did appreciate the fact that you brought this forward and we can carry on that conversation. And in fact, this portion of the symposium panel is really to have a broader conversation. And one of the things I was curious about, I guess I don't know if it comes from my years of teaching or not, but I like to think of what would the most resistant-minded listener take from this if they wanted to really. And I thought, what if the person wants to stand up and say, so what you all are telling me is that everyone had slavery, and Indians had slavery, Africans had slavery, white people had slavery. So what's the big deal? Everyone's guilty. Can't we all just say it was bad and we've moved on? That someone who wants this incredibly reductive, it's all bad. And therefore, on the other side of that, and it's all good. So we just move on. We kind of homogenize, obscure important differences. How do you respond when you get maybe not something that flagrant, but that's in that spirit where you feel like that's kind of what's behind a question? I guess I'll just take this in the order that we presented, and you might, Professor Deloria, you presented us with a really global context. So we might start there, but also then move on to Professor Miles and then Professor Reséndez at the end. So.
Thanks for the question, Scott. I mean, it is the case that when one starts in a global sort of setting and says it happens everywhere, it happens in all continents, it happens in all times, there is the possibility of sort of homogenizing. But I think, what we're all trying to do to speak to is that these things have very specific historical context. They unfold in very specific kinds of historical ways. One of the things that Andrés has argued, just told us is, look, one of the big developments at this particular moment is the moving of these practices of enslavement and unfreedom from specific cultural kinds of contexts, oftentimes which were smaller in scale, to very, very much larger things. So I think if we ask ourselves who are the salient actors in this globalized kind of enslavement, we're pushed to think about a couple of things, about the formation of racial kinds of consciousness and about where white supremacy fits into that particular form. That in itself tells us that these things are not equivalent. They can't just be sort of held up as all manifestations of, of the same thing. The second thing I think that Andrés also pointed to is the commodification aspect of this, which isn't to say that slavery didn't have and hasn't had elements of barter and exchange. Part of the very nature of it is the abstraction of the labor of the enslaved kind of person. But if we think about the development of capitalism actually unfolding at exactly the same moments that we're talking about here, we're taken to new and more complicated forms of abstraction and speculation, these kinds of things. So to me, those historical contexts really matter. And when you ask those questions, you ask, I think, who benefited in woefully, wildly uneven kinds of ways here, right? And the answer is, it was not African people who were engaged in, slaving activities in Africa, and it was not indigenous people who were engaged in slaving activities in North America and South America and the Caribbean, right? It was, Europeans on a very, very large and grand scale.
Thank you.
Scott, I appreciate that question so much. Thank you for taking us right to the heart of what really could be a point of frustration for people who are watching and listening to us discuss this topic. I think that Phil has really set us off in a fitting direction by pointing out the issue of benefit and harm, and also by pointing out the fact that we are looking at a very complex set of situations and experiences. We would not want to reduce what it is that we're finding out, what it is that we're learning, and what we know about enslavement to one particular aspect or facet. That would be counter to our aim here on this panel and to our shared and collective aims as scholars and people who are seeking some form of the truth about the past and the ways in which that past influences our present. I will say that I think there is perhaps a bit of danger, a bit of risk in this particular topic and in the way in which we have approached it. Although I fully support this topic, I am so grateful to Andrés for presenting the work that he has about Indigenous enslavement. The risk could be that African Americans watching this and thinking about this could feel that our experience of enslavement, our history of enslavement is being sidelined, that it is being marginalized, and that it is being kind of collapsed into, as your question put it, Scott, all these different kinds of forms of abuse in which everybody was enslaved and everybody was enslaved. That would certainly feel like an offense, I think, to the descendants of African enslaved people. And that is not what we are doing, I feel very strongly. Instead, we are trying to ferret out and to identify and to explain the ways in which Indigenous enslavement, which was foundational, pivotal, central to other forms of abuse, exploitation, and enslavement on this continent and in this country, can show us more, not just about Native lives, but also about the ways in which humanity has behaved and can behave and does behave in the present day. So to my mind, this lens of Indigenous enslavement opens up a critical reality about Native lives. And it also reminds us of human behavior writ large and the kinds of vulnerabilities that all peoples have faced. I want to come back to a point that Andrés made, which was very, very important, I think, here, with regard to this question of where does African slavery fit in. He said that African slavery was the outlier. This is a point that actually underscores an argument that Black slavery is still one of the most central topics that we have to contend with when trying to understand the history of the United States. The fact that it was an outlier points us to a recognition that it had its own kind of qualities and characteristics that are key that we must learn about and continue to talk about. But an outlier is not the same as saying that it was everything, because that was not the case. And so I guess I would appeal to our viewers and listeners and to the people out there in the audience to be patient with us and with the panels to come to be open-minded and to try to hold in mind that we are talking about a complexity, a kaleidoscope, to borrow the term that's been used today, of experiences of enslavement. And at the same time, we recognize that African enslavement was an outlier. It was its own kind of terrible horror that we must continue to research, study, understand, and also mourn.
Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, this is a very serious and very important, it's a central conversation we need to have. And this is something that I wrestled with since the very beginning of the book project that led to the other slavery. I didn't want to turn this project into a race to the bottom about who had lost the most between African Americans or Native Americans. Both groups lost incommensurably, and it is not also about who had the most casualties or who suffered the most, etc. That is a completely counterproductive approach. So I really appreciate the question that Scott posed and these two comments by Phil and Tiya. I also had two additional thoughts about this. One is that it is in some ways helpful to think that this really is a part of the human nature. All societies that were who stood to benefit from enslavement in one form or another did it. And this is it's not to put everything on the same footing, but it is liberating in the sense that in the 19th century narrative of nations, in which some nations are good and some of them are bad, some of them are ambitious and some of them are victims, etc., there's always the search for the good people and the bad people, and slavery plays a role in that characterization. And if we just take a step back and say, okay, everybody who stood to benefit did it. Okay, not absolutely everybody. Some native groups, for example, for whom ecologically or economically did not make sense to take captives, didn't do it. But basically, Native Americans, European powers, modern nations like the United States, Mexico, Colombia did it. So we can fight that narrative of good and bad in very powerful ways with these other way to think about the forms of coercion and enslavement, which were so prevalent. So that's one thought, and the other thought that occurred to me is that, in fact, the history of Indian slavery is very central to African slavery and vice versa. These two are very connected, and I think that's the frontier that we really need to further explore, because these two forms of coercion coexisted, or multiple forms of coercion coexisted side by side, even in the same work sites. There were African slaves and there were native slaves, and there were freed Africans and free natives working in the same mines, for example. I haven't encountered them. And exactly how these different coercive systems that nonetheless touched each other, influenced each other, is absolutely central. And let me just offer one example which I find quite fascinating, which is, of course, in the aftermath of the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation, etc. Many of the forms of coercion that led to the re-enslavement of African Americans in the South, for example, vagrancy laws, etc., were utterly familiar to Native Americans who were living farther west or farther north, etc. So even though African slavery may have ended with the end of the Civil War, the other slavery had just gotten started there. And interestingly enough, for example, the Congress passed the Peonage Act of 1867 with New Mexico in mind to limit that peonage in New Mexico was so rife there. But the cases that were brought to the court, some of them unfolded in the South. So the institution became later on in the 1890s and early 1900s in the South. So it shows again how we are not really in a race to the bottom, but we are in a race to try to understand better how these different forms of coercion fed off each other, supported each other, and led to the kinds of formations that subsist until today in some way. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it reminds me of a friend of mine used to say there's no gold medal in the human suffering Olympics, right? I mean, there's nothing to be gained by this claim. And we have to recognize where things are historically unique and special in terms of the legacy, the impact, the scale. And I think that that's an important part of what we can hope to talk more about during the whole of this symposium. Another question that comes to mind, and this particularly comes to mind in your work, Professor Miles, is I'm often very moved. I'm very frequently moved by the stories that I'm reading, these accounts, and there's a strong level of affect in them. And you use the word that we should mourn these things, and I agree. And I'm wondering, do you think that there's, at least in academic discourse, do you find a kind of resistance to allowing that affective experience to be part of our interpretation of records, to be part of the arc of an argument that we're making, and so on? I'm just curious about that, and if Phil or Andrés have want to weigh in as well from their own research, but I am curious about that.
Thank you for that, Scott. Your questions are so on point. Your question it really invites me to tell a story, which is kind of a personal story, and it dates back to the time when I was just out of graduate school and applying for academic positions in history departments and in American Studies departments and African American Studies departments. And I had an on-campus interview with the history department in the Midwest. And as a part of my talk, I presented a document which showed the intention of a Cherokee man named Shoe Boots to free children that he had had with an enslaved woman he owned named Doll. I talked in that presentation about what it had been like to find that document and about what it meant to me. And I said that I loved the document because I did, because it was a moment of triumph, a rare and fleeting moment of triumph in this family's story. And afterwards, one of the people who was on the search committee said to me over dinner, as historians, we never say we love our documents. And so I felt chagrined, and I filed that away. And I think it was a very long time before I ever used emotional terminology in referring to my topics or my questions. But currently, I just completed a project where I've come right back around to that word love because it seems so central to the story. Well, not seems, it is so central to the story. It is one of the chief primary ways that people have survived this onslaught of brutality that we have all been laying out during our session today. And so I think that the academic reach toward an objectivity, which actually can never be obtained, that the academic resistance to affective response and to emotional language does us a disservice in trying to understand these historical experiences, and also in trying to relate them, to translate them for and with our students, our readers, and people who we may come across in venues such as this. So I think that we need to recover the emotional. I think we need to do it responsibly and with an awareness of ways in which that emotional button can also mislead. It can also lead people to shut down their cognitive processes and to shut down their analytical processes when they're thinking about events, people, and ideas.
Thank you so much. Phil or Andrés?
I could say one additional thing, which is that I do believe after writing a book about slavery, that is a very challenging subject because it is both very emotional, first of all, emotionally draining. That's why I'm writing about something completely different now after 7 years of that. But you are right that the documentation draws you into these incredible stories, and that is something that I was very conscious about from the very beginning. It is very easy to revert to the sociological generality of the Indian slaves or slavery, even more abstract here and there. But we really you really reach another level of understanding when you confront the story of Beatriz or Catalina or their children living in a household in ways that it is impossible to convey with the more typical academic generalized argument kind of a thing. So it is. So in the course of writing the book, I gained a newfound appreciation of how extraordinarily difficult these particular topic is, because it is so charged emotionally, yet you want to retain a sense of proportion of exactly, okay, so how many were there, who are we talking about, what regions, etc. So it is a very demanding subject, and the world of affection plays a very significant role in this. You really need to be able to be empathic in order to truly understand what this topic is about.
I mean, it is part of the practice of the historian to reach for these kinds of balances where one steps back and makes certain kinds of assessments. But that doesn't really happen without, a really engaged and creative use of the historical imagination. I mean, Tiya, you are my role model for doing this, book after book after book, your ability to imagine yourself into the place. And I think the consequence of that imagination is that, you cannot be emotionally disconnected. And I think it's entirely possible for the historian to, open themselves up, to some small measure, of the trauma that was experienced by historical kinds of subjects. And obviously we're not reproducing that, but an emotional engagement. And then once you've done that, how do you step back into a voice that is only distanced, and quote unquote objective? I mean, I think it's not possible. And I would completely say there are documents I love.
Yeah. Now, I think that, and I also take to heart Tiya's, warning, as it were, that we don't want to, if certain emotions I think are inevitable to engage in, but one wouldn't want writing to inflame passions of fear, hatred, and so on, and so there are definitely limits, ethical, moral limits we put on those types of writing. And that's part of the judgment that goes into history writing. I think that's what, as a literature scholar, that I've always admired about history writing, is that it takes, when I've asked my students, what do they think is the difference between history and literature? And they'll say, well, history just says what happened. And I'm like, wow, just like that, right? Transparent, no filter on it, anything. It's just as it happened. And I said, well, would that it could, but that it's a very refined art of its own. It's a balance, and when done well and ethically, really does serve to awaken in other people those distant experiences where you are moved by the words of a document about a 17th century indentured native person. And so I think that's part of what I've really enjoyed about being able to work with the three of you on this, just on this panel, and think about it from my own perspective as a scholar. Because normally I'm talking about poetry or a painting, and this is a different world, but certainly one that informs my own thinking deeply. I wondered if any of we've all listened to each other present, and if any of you wanted to pose a question to one of your co-panelists, or
I would happily pose a question, Scott, if the floor is open. And the question is this: I began my comments by saying that I'm a complete novice to this field, and I've been truly trying to, of course, I've read some of the very standard books, including the works by Andrés and by Tiya, and but I've been trying to get my head around it. And one of the things that came to me out of this little exercise that I was trying to do is the way that the category of slavery, which I had taken, I think, from my earliest education to be conceptually stable, around basically African American, American-styled Southern African American slavery, has started to feel to me much less stable conceptually. And Andrés, the very title of your book, right, The Other Slavery, suggests, and the fact that we've been talking about other slaveries suggests that that what is the other of the other slaveries? I wonder if you would say that base kind of sensibility of conceptual stability, lies with our sense of African American slavery, and how you see the definitional kind of project of thinking about slavery, in relation to these broader kinds of, sets of practices. How do we think about defining this thing? And I mean, is it not useful, to expand this definition in certain ways, or are there certain things, elements, social death, some of the very coercion, violence, that absolutely have to be central to to a definition of slavery? This may be just, again, a novice question of someone who is missing certain parts of the field, but it feels to me personally like one that's important, and I'm just wondering if either of you have something helpful to tell me about it.
I mean, I'd be happy to say a few things, but Tiya, do you want to say something?
After you do.
Okay. Yes. So thank you for the question, Phil. That definitional problem was ever present in every presentation that I made about this project in the years leading up to my writing it. It was, okay, so what do you really mean by this other slavery? What is the definition? And then I felt into a straitjacket. So if it is not this, that, as you very rightly point out, it's these chattel slavery that came to characterize the Southern United States, in other parts of the United States in the early 19th century, then it is not slavery. Yet what I was looking at in the documents was a great variety of coercive practices that, because of their very scatterness, did not have the same kind of or demanded the same kind of attention. So I was, every time I gave a presentation, thrust in this terrible dilemma of, okay, so what do I really mean by that? First of all, because very early on I wanted to count, to at least offer some preliminary estimates. And if you want to count them, you need to know who they are. And yet I didn't have a definition because of the incredible variety of coercive practices to which Native peoples were subjected to. So in my desperate attempts to try to come to terms with this, I devised at least a stopgap measure, so to speak, which is that I came up with characteristics that tended to be associated with these different forms of coercion. So one of them was the forcible movement of Native people from one place to another. And again, it didn't happen always, but it often happened mostly because of practical reasons, right? If you were enslaving somebody who was living right next to you, then you were opening yourself to retribution from those people. So they needed to be taken from to a place farther away. So forcible removal, that was one. Then the inability to leave the place of work was another. Again, it was not always the case, but it was almost always the case. The threat of force, or the threat of violence, at least to get people to work, was yet another characteristic that tended to exist. And finally, the payment. This is one that, okay, are they getting paid in the repartimiento system, for example? Yes, they are. But the pay that they were receiving was so below market. They were doing it unwillingly. It was something symbolic oftentimes, or it was often in kind, not even, silver or money, etc. So yeah, payment existed, and sometimes it was completely symbolic. So if payment was so below marketplaces, then that's another indication, a fourth characteristic. So that's the only that's the only thing I could do. But I do find myself guilty of being a lumper, because I wanted to bring attention to these type of other variety of forms of enslavement that individually taken did not seem to match the gravitas and the attention given to African slavery. And so that's why I lumped them into these other slavery kind of a category, which always creates this definitional problem and always leaves us to this question like Phil had.
The only thing worse about being about trying to be writing definitions is being a splitter, right? I mean, bad enough to be a lumper, worse to be a splitter.
Yeah, right.
I wonder what that makes me if I'm on a panel with a lumper and a splitter. Well, I mean, I think that it is a tough question to think through and to respond to, Phil. I guess my first thought and reaction to it is that the picture that you described of that stable Southern chattel slavery, it's one that many of us hold. And I think it has been an object, a goal of slavery studies, U.S. focused slavery studies, U.S. focused Black slavery studies, let me say, to try to open that up and to try to understand all the different little pieces of it that make it a mosaic, as opposed to a whole cloth picture. So it's not stable. As you know, I think that's partly what you're saying. It's not stable. It never was stable. And our sense of stability for that moment and place and time is actually an illusion, and maybe one that we needed to hold on to for our own purposes, but that is not actually accurate. I must admit that when I first read Andrés' work and Ben Madley's work, I felt a little bit resistant. I had a question about, are all these things really slavery? And if we're going to call all of these things slavery, what does that do to African American slavery? Right now, in this conversation, especially, but also as I've processed those books and thought about them, I am of the mind that it is okay for us to use the term slavery flexibly. Slavery does not have to denote one particular place or group of people or experience. Maybe what we need is better language to actually identify and characterize that non-stable kind of slavery that you were talking about in your question, Phil. So I'm willing to let go of slavery having first to describe a Black experience. And I'd like to call for all of us to try to think about the more fine-grained and nuanced language that we need to actually capture that African American experience. And one last thought on this. Andrés, I thank you for bringing gravitas to this aspect of the history. I think it was sorely needed.
Thank you.
Well, I think that brings us to the end of our time, but I am really delighted to have been part of this and to hear all of your comments and your presentations I think is a really wonderful way to begin this symposium. These are some thorny, difficult issues that we'll be thinking of for a long time after. But I think that we've had a good beginning here and a good start of a conversation that will work on, continuing and refining as we go forward. But I especially want to thank my three panelists, Philip Deloria, Tiya Miles, and Andrés Reséndez. Thank you very much for your contributions and for your work. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.
Thank you, Scott.